It was an ordinary afternoon on patrol for officers Taylor and Roberts. The small city they worked in was peaceful, and the roads were familiar. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. The officers cruised through the neighborhood, their patrol car rolling quietly along the well-worn asphalt. As they drove, Officer Taylor noticed a sleek black sedan up ahead, moving just below the speed limit. It was unusual for cars to drive so cautiously in this area. "Looks like an out-of-towner," Taylor remarked, his eyes narrowing. "Let's check it out." Officer Roberts nodded in agreement. "Never hurts to be thorough," he said, flipping on the siren and signaling for the car to pull over. The sedan smoothly eased onto the shoulder, and the two officers pulled up behind it, ready to approach. The officers approached cautiously, their boots crunching against the gravel as they walked. Officer Roberts kept his hand near his holster, ready for anything. Taylor, on the other hand, kept his posture relaxed but alert. The woman sitting in the driver's seat looked composed and calm, not the least bit flustered by the situation. "Good afternoon, officers," she said with a polite, steady voice. "Is there an issue?" Officer Roberts glanced at his partner before responding. "Just a routine check," he said, his tone neutral. "License and registration, please." The woman smiled faintly and nodded. "Of course." She reached into her bag and handed over the requested documents. Officer Taylor took the papers and examined them briefly, his gaze lingering on the name and details. Taylor looked back at her and raised an eyebrow. "What brings you to this part of town?" The woman smiled again, her expression knowing but still composed. "I'm headed to the station," she replied, her voice steady. "Got some important work to do." Officer Roberts raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Are you visiting someone at the station? A friend? Family?" The woman's lips curled into a slight smile, her eyes glinting with a hint of humor. "You could say that," she replied cryptically, reaching back into her bag. She pulled out a badge, holding it up for the officers to see. "I'm your new chief of police." The officers froze, their faces displaying a mix of surprise, confusion, and disbelief. They exchanged a glance as if trying to process what they had just heard. "You're the chief?" Officer Taylor finally managed to ask, his voice trailing off in disbelief. "Yes," she replied gently, her tone calm but firm. "And I'm glad we're meeting this way, because first impressions are important." The two officers stood in stunned silence for a moment, processing the information. They had expected a routine traffic stop, not an encounter with their new boss. "I understand," Officer Roberts said after a moment, his voice now filled with respect. "Our apologies, Chief." The woman nodded and smiled, her demeanor still calm. "No need to apologize," she said. "You were doing your job. But let this be a reminder that respect isn't just about rank or authority. It's about how we treat each other, no matter who they are." With that, she handed back her papers, nodded politely, and got back into her car. The officers stood for a moment, still processing the encounter, before watching her drive off. Later that afternoon, Chief Daniels walked into the bustling police station, where officers of every rank had gathered for her first official address. The room was filled with the usual noise of officers chatting, filling out paperwork, and organizing equipment. But as Chief Daniels entered, a sudden hush fell over the room. Every officer, no matter their rank, turned their attention toward her. She stood at the front of the room, her eyes sweeping over the officers. Some faces were eager, others wary. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Chief Daniels took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. "I know some of you might have heard about my first encounter with a few of you today," she began, her voice calm yet firm. "I want to take a moment to reflect on that meeting." A murmur ran through the room. The officers exchanged curious glances, unsure where this would lead. Chief Daniels continued, her gaze unwavering. "What happened today wasn't about me asserting my authority. It was about understanding something deeper, how we approach each other and how we hold ourselves accountable." The room was quiet now. Chief Daniels' words were measured, her presence commanding. "I was pulled over by two of you today, and I want to thank them. Not because of the stop, but because of the way they conducted themselves. They treated me with respect. That is what matters." Some officers shifted in their seats. It was clear they hadn't expected this kind of message. Chief Daniels paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Respect isn't about rank. It's about treating people, no matter who they are, with dignity. It's about listening, understanding, and working together. It's something we must carry with us in every interaction. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of several officers. As your chief, I want to lead by example. I will hold myself to the same standards I expect from you. And I expect each of you to hold yourselves accountable, not just for your actions, but for how you treat others. There was a brief silence as her words hung in the air. Some of the officers were nodding in agreement, while others remained silent, clearly processing what she had said. This department is going to change, Chief Daniels continued, her voice rising slightly with conviction. We're going to rebuild trust with the community, and we're going to do it by showing them who we really are. We'll be transparent, accountable, and above all, respectful. The officers exchanged looks again, some hesitant, others hopeful. The room was still, but the energy was shifting. Chief Daniels smiled. I'm looking forward to working with each of you, but the time for change is now. With that, she stepped down from the podium. The room remained silent for a moment before the first round of applause began, slow at first but building in intensity. Chief Daniels stood tall, her heart pounding with the weight of the moment. She had made her statement. Now it was time to lead. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Chief Daniels wasted no time in making her presence felt in the department. She conducted one-on-one meetings with every officer, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned veteran. The officers found her approach refreshing, direct, honest, and no nonsense. She listened to their concerns, offered advice, and made it clear that their input mattered. However, it wasn't long before the first test of her leadership arrived. One chilly morning, the department received a call about a neighborhood disturbance. A group of teenagers had gathered at a local park, causing trouble. It wasn't the first time such a situation had occurred, and the officers who responded were familiar with the group of kids. But this time, Chief Daniels was determined to handle the situation differently. When the officers arrived at the park, they saw a group of teenagers hanging around near the playground. Some were yelling, others were arguing, and there was an undeniable sense of tension in the air. The officers, knowing the kids, were ready to move in and start making arrests. It was routine after all, but Chief Daniels, who had arrived moments later, had a different plan. Hold on, she said, raising her hand as she stepped forward. I'll handle this. The officers looked at each other, unsure of what to expect, but they respected her enough to stay back and let her take charge. Chief Daniels walked over to the group of teenagers, her approach calm and non-threatening. Hey there, she called out, her voice steady but kind. What's going on? The teenagers paused, some of them looking surprised at her sudden appearance. One of them, a young man with a scowl on his face, stepped forward. Nothing, lady, just minding our own business, he said, clearly irritated. Chief Daniels smiled faintly, keeping her distance but not backing down. I get that, she said, but people are complaining, and when that happens, it's our job to listen and make sure things don't escalate. The young man frowned but seemed to soften slightly at her calm demeanor. So what, you gonna arrest us or something? He asked, clearly testing her patience. Chief Daniels shook her head. No arrest today, but I want you all to keep it down. The last thing we want is for things to get out of hand. Her tone was firm, but there was no hostility. She wasn't threatening them. She was talking to them as equals. The group fell into an uneasy silence. After a moment, the young man nodded, muttering something under his breath, and the group slowly started to disperse. Chief Daniels watched them go, making sure the situation de-escalated without further conflict. When the officers who had been standing back approached, they were visibly impressed. Chief, you handled that well, Officer Roberts said, his tone filled with respect. You didn't rush to arrest them. You diffused the situation with just your words. Chief Daniels smiled, her expression warm but thoughtful. That's the kind of leadership I believe in. It's about finding the right moment, the right words. Sometimes arresting people isn't the answer. Sometimes we just need to listen. The officers nodded, and as they headed back to the station, they began to see what Chief Daniels meant. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building trust, one interaction at a time. As weeks passed, Chief Daniels' leadership style continued to challenge the status quo. Her approach wasn't always easy, especially when it came to the more traditional officers who had been in the department for years. Some were skeptical of her methods. They'd been trained to respond to situations with force, to assert control through dominance. But Daniels had a different vision. One morning, a situation arose that would test her leadership in a way she hadn't anticipated. A local business owner had called the police to report a suspected shoplifter in his store. The suspect was a young man, and by all accounts, it seemed like a standard theft case. The officers who responded were ready to act quickly, to arrest and charge the young man. But Chief Daniels had a different plan in mind. When she arrived at the scene, she saw the young man sitting in a chair, his head bowed in shame. The store owner was furious, pacing back and forth, demanding that the young man be arrested immediately. But Daniels, ever calm, stepped forward and approached the young man, asking him to explain himself. "Why did you do it?" Chief Daniels asked, her voice soft but firm. "Is this the only way you could think of to get by?" The young man looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. He hesitated before speaking. I don't have a job. My family's struggling. I just wanted to get by." Chief Daniels listened quietly, nodding as she processed his words. The store owner, however, was having none of it. "He stole from me. He deserves to be locked up," he shouted, his frustration evident. But Daniels stood her ground. "I understand your frustration, sir," she said calmly, "but arresting this young man won't solve the problem. His situation is a symptom of something deeper. Poverty, lack of opportunity. We need to address that, not just punish him." The store owner was quiet for a moment, still seething, but clearly unsure of how to respond. Chief Daniels turned to the young man. "I'm going to give you a chance, but I'm going to need you to take responsibility. You're going to work with me. I'm going to help you find a job. We're going to find a way out of this." The young man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're not arresting me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Daniels shook her head. "Not today, but you have to make it right." Over the following weeks, Daniels worked with community organizations to help the young man secure a job. She also arranged for him to participate in a mentorship program designed to give young people from disadvantaged backgrounds the skills they needed to succeed. Meanwhile, the store owner, though initially reluctant, came to respect Daniels' decision. He even agreed to speak at a community meeting she organized, acknowledging the deeper issues that led to such incidents. The incident became a turning point not just for the young man, but for the entire department. Chief Daniels' approach to law enforcement, one that prioritized understanding, empathy, and rehabilitation over punishment, was beginning to take root. Officers who had once been skeptical of her methods now began to see the value in her approach. They saw firsthand how the right kind of intervention could change a life, and they started to understand that their role as law enforcement officers was not just to enforce the law, but to serve the community. Chief Daniels had proven that leadership was not about power, but about making the difficult choices, standing firm in the face of adversity, and leading with integrity. As the department continued to evolve under her guidance, it became clear that she was not just a leader, she was a change maker.